YouTube. Oke.
Ya,
Oke,
lagi.
lanjut.
Oke, all set. Go ahead, Naila.
Oh, it's not yet 7 o'clock. I thought it's going to be looping. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar on Global ESG Disclosure Standards for Investment Products. This webinar is a cooperation of CFA Institute, CFA Society Indonesia, Indonesia Certified Investment Managers Association or PWMII, and Investment Managers Association of Indonesia or AMII. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Naila Firdausi. I am a CFA charter holder and a volunteer at CFA Society Indonesia. I will be your host for tonight. Now the Zoom webinar rule. Tonight's session will be conducted in English. Please write your name as registered, but all participants will be muted. This webinar pulls questions during the session for the Q&A session later. If you'd like to ask questions, please write them in the chat or Q&A session at any moment or raise hand to be unmuted. Moderator will be address them sequentially during the Q&A. So we are honored to have Chris Fiedler with us tonight. Chris is the Senior Director on the Codes and Standards team at CFA Institute. He led the development of the Global ESG Disclosure Standards for Investment Products, the first global voluntary standards for disclosing how an investment product considers ESG issues in its objectives, investment process, and stewardship activities. Chris has expert-level knowledge of investment product ESG disclosure regulation globally and currently serves on the UK FCA Disclosure and Labeling Advisory Group. Prior to joining CFS Institute, Mr. Fiedler was a management consultant at ThoughtLogic Consulting LLC and served in a number of management and analyst roles at Capital One Financial Corporation. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from University of Illinois and a Master Business Administration from the Darden School of Business at University of Virginia. Chris, time is yours.
Thank you, Lina. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight and share information with you about the CFA Institute Global ESG Disclosure Standards for Investment Products. I'm going to share my screen and share with you a presentation. And Naila, I'll ask if you can help look for questions. I'm not sure that I'll be able to see them while the presentation is up. So if you see a question come in that's relevant to what we're talking about, feel free to pose that question as we go. Otherwise, I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Yeah.
I'd like to begin by talking about the problem that the standards set out to solve. And that problem is that it can be very difficult for investors, consultants, distributors, advisors, other people to understand how ESG information and issues are taken in account within a fund or strategy. And there's a couple of reasons why this problem arises. The first is that sometimes information can be incomplete. Manager might omit certain information. Let me give you one example of that we've seen in a project that we're undertaking right now to identify greenwashing. We found a fund that says that its goal is to seek total returns and also to seek certain ESG characteristics that they specify that are better than the index. And it reports on its own ESG characteristics, but it doesn't report on the characteristics of the benchmark. And these metrics are not available through the index. And so it's an unsubstantiated claim. An investor has no way to know whether the product is actually meeting its goal or not. Another big problem that we see are statements or claims that are vague or ambiguous. There's lots of problems with this. It can be problems of terminology, where people use the word sustainable, for example, in the name of a fund or strategy. But when you dig into the documentation, there's no definition of what they mean by sustainable. There's very little discussion, sometimes if any, about how sustainability considerations are incorporated into the fund's objective or its principal investment strategies. And it may just be looking at ESG risk management or doing ESG risk management, which not everyone would consider to be a sustainable strategy. We see inconsistencies. Another place in our research that we've seen a relatively big problem is inconsistent disclosure of screening criteria. We'll see a manager's website that says that it excludes certain sorts of investments, but then when you look at the legal documentation, you see a different set of exclusions. That can be, if not misleading, certainly confusing for anyone who's trying to evaluate the fund. Using poorly defined terminology, as you probably know, there's some debate over terms like ESG integration or screening or thematic investing and what those really mean, particularly in the context of ESG or sustainable investing. And another big problem is just simply that information is spread across multiple documents. To try and understand a fund or strategy, you have to look from an ESG perspective. You'll often have to look at marketing materials, the website, the prospectus, maybe impact reports, maybe firm level information. So it's quite difficult. If you've ever tried to do this, you probably know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't ever tried, I'd encourage you to maybe just pick a fund or two and look through its documentation and see if you can understand exactly what that fund is doing and how it's incorporating ESG issues or information. So with that backdrop, let me tell you a little bit about the global ESG disclosure standards for investment products. These are the first global voluntary standards for fund and strategy disclosures. So they are not designed for manager level disclosures, meaning they're not designed to explain what the manager might be doing across all of its funds and strategies. The standards don't assume that managers have one single consistent process for ESG integration. You might, and a manager might apply that to all of its funds and strategies, but we allow for the fact that managers might have very different investment products for different funds and strategies to meet different sorts of needs and preferences that their clients have. Also, before I go into the details, I want to say that we designed the requirements to pertain only to the design of the product, its investment objectives, its investment strategies, and the way, and its policies, the way stewardship activities might be conducted. So there are no requirements in the standards for ongoing reporting of the portfolio characteristics or maybe real world impacts. For example, there are some requirements about where investors could find information like that, but it's not set up to be an ongoing reporting standard. It's really more a standard for what you might call pre-contractual disclosures. So that means that managers don't have to update their disclosures that they make under these standards, really, unless the strategy changes or the standards change. Now, let me give you a little bit of an overview of the sorts of requirements that are in these standards. And I'll divide them into a couple of buckets here. The first bucket is summary level requirements. So managers need to provide a summary description of the ESG approaches that they use in the funder strategy. And by ESG approaches, we essentially mean these 7 methods that we're going to get to in just a moment. Secondly, managers have to provide a summary description of any specific ESG issues that are addressed in the funder strategy. Now, as you probably know, certain funds and strategies have a particular focus and they market that focus. Sometimes it might be a low carbon fund, it could be a gender diversity fund, it could be water, it could be lots of different things. And if it is focused around some particular issue, then the manager needs to specify what that issue is. Other ESG products are designed in a way where they are not designed around specific issues. For example, a product that integrates material ESG issues into its investment analysis process for the sake of risk and return isn't claiming that it's going to look at particular issues. The claim is that we'll evaluate all issues, we'll find the ones that are material, and we'll incorporate those appropriately along with lots of other information. In that case, this requirement really doesn't apply, and that product wouldn't have to make a disclosure about specific issues. The third summary level requirement is to disclose any third-party ESG labels or certifications that the funder strategy has been awarded or that it complies with. Now, I'm not sure if you have any of these types of labels and certifications in the Indonesian market. There's about a dozen worldwide. The closest one to you is the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. They have 3 different certifications. I believe they have an ethical certification, a sustainable certification, and an impact certification. There's also about a dozen of these in Europe. The Towards Sustainability label by Febelfin, the Greenfin label in France, and there's a number of others. The second type of disclosure requirement in these standards are around the inputs that managers use, specifically sources and types of information. By sources, we mean, where do you get the information? Are you looking directly at company disclosures? Are you using a third-party data aggregator? Are you looking at publicly available information? And types, there's lots of different types. It could be raw data, could be ratings, could be scores, could be estimates. So the standards don't require managers to disclose the names of third parties where they're getting their data, but a general description of the sources and types of information. It also requires you to disclose then where are you using that information in the investment process, and also the risks and limitations of using that information. If you've used ESG information at all, you know that there are some risks and limitations. Oftentimes, third-party data sets don't cover every single investment in the investment universe. Sometimes data points are estimated, not reported. So these are the sorts of things that need to be disclosed so that an investor could understand if there's risks and limitations of the information being used. And last but certainly not least, because this is the majority of the requirements, are around the methodologies that managers use to essentially design or build a fund and strategy. And there's 7 here, and I'll just go through them quickly. The first one you might understand is ESG integration. We didn't use that word because, again, there's some debate about exactly what that word means. So we said systematic consideration of financially material information into investment decisions. That's certainly one way that you can incorporate ESG information into an investment process. Another way is to use an ESG index as your investment universe. So I do understand that there are some products in the Indonesian marketplace that track ESG indexes. And in that case, what the fund would need to disclose is the name of the ESG index, as well as the general characteristics of that index, and let investors know where they could find more information about the index. So we don't require managers to disclose too much or to replicate the index construction methodology. We thought that would be too much information, but certainly those signposts about where they can find more information is certainly helpful. ESG screening is another very common way to consider ESG factors. Okay? Essentially, screening criteria are rules, and often they're assumed to be binding rules, meaning that the manager is going to follow these rules. Not that they can't ever be changed, but there's there would need to be some process or governance around those changes. You'll often see funds that exclude coal or exclude oil or tobacco or certain types of other business practices. You'll see negative screening that excludes things. You'll see positive screening that includes companies that are favorable in some way. All these different scenarios are covered under the standards, and they simply require a disclosure of the rules. Because what we found is all these different words for screening, like positive and negative and best in class, are quite confusing, particularly to people outside the industry. And what they really need to know is what's in and what's out of the fund. Another way to design an ESG product is to have certain target characteristics that you want to have in the portfolio. So again, if kind of gave the example of a fund that was looking to have better ESG characteristics than the index, that's fine. That's a design criteria. And so what needs to be disclosed is what are those characteristics, how are they going to be measured, and what's the target? And how are you going to report on those characteristics? How are you going to show that you're actually meeting the intent? Another common way is to set portfolio level allocation targets. So for example, a fund might say that 80% of its investments will be in certain economic activities that are part of a taxonomy. And I understand that in Indonesia, that is one of the things that is being developed right now. And so with the development of that taxonomy, this requirement might become very important to funds and strategies that are then using that taxonomy to allocate investments to those economic activities. Another common place to integrate ESG, and I use that word loosely, integrate, not formally, but to incorporate ESG considerations is in stewardship activities. We use that term broadly. It could mean proxy votes. It could mean engagement. It could mean taking positions on the board if you're private equity. It could mean making improvements to real estate. If ESG considerations are used in those processes, essentially what managers need to disclose is where an investor can find their stewardship policies, how the manager reports on their stewardship activities, how ESG considerations are brought into the decisions and activities, and how those link to the overall investment objectives and strategies. And last but not least, if a fund or strategy has specific environmental or social impact objectives that it's pursuing alongside its risk and return objectives, then it needs to specifically disclose what those objectives are, along with a number of other relevant things like how is that objective going to be measured? How is it going to be reported on to investors? What's the plan for achieving the objective? What are the risks of achieving that objective? We don't see too many products out in the marketplace that have very specific objectives, very specific environmental or impact objectives, but there are some out there. And there's certainly a history of these sorts of products in the impact investing world. Okay, so that's a quick overview of the sorts of requirements that you'll see in the standards. Next, I would like to talk about the benefits. Again, we talked about the problem and what disclosures sort of look like today. Let's imagine a world where the disclosures are high quality and they're understandable, they're clear, they accurately represent the strategy. Well, how would that help investors and consultants and distributors? Well, it would certainly help them better understand, evaluate, and compare the ESG approaches used in different products. And by doing that, it complements and streamlines some of the more fundamental things that they're trying to accomplish, like conduct a manager search, select a particular fund or strategy, perform due diligence, report up to maybe a pension board or other stakeholders about how they're incorporating ESG and sustainable considerations, and their record-keeping processes. Now, investment managers certainly are the ones that need to write these disclosures. So there's a bit of effort on their part. And it's fair to ask, well, what benefit does a manager get from using these standards? First and foremost, I would say the benefit is helping to facilitate the sales and distributions of your products. Because what we found is that when investors are confused about what a fund or strategy is doing, they tend not to invest in it. So if you put out information, and you advertise all the things that your fund might be doing from an ESG or an environmental standpoint, it will raise questions in people's minds, questions that they might not have had if they were buying, a plain vanilla fund. And so you have to be very careful and think from their point of view, how can I make this information clear to them? How can I make it understandable to them? Second, we feel that these standards can save managers time and effort responding to requests for proposals or requests for information and due diligence questionnaires. What we've heard from managers is that asset owners and consultants are asking lots of different questions. And they have to keep answering lots of different questions in lots of different ways. What we found in working with developing these standards with a diverse group of people, including asset owners and consultants and managers, is that a lot of times they're really trying to get to the same sort of information, and that is exactly how is this fund or strategy put together? What can I expect from it? And so by being proactive and thinking about all the methods that you've used in the fund or strategy and disclosing then the parameters and how you've used these strategies and putting it all in one document, that really should answer most questions. Now, that isn't to say that it's going to fully replace due diligence. We didn't design it to be that way, but it would certainly give people more information up front, let them better understand, is this product even worth doing due diligence on? And it might give them information that they didn't even think to ask about. So it shows that you're really thinking, again, that you're putting yourself in their shoes and that you're thinking about what sort of information they want to have, and you're using a best practice standard to try and deliver that information to them. A third benefit for managers is that undertaking this exercise of understanding and clearly communicating your ESG approaches can help reduce reputation, legal, and compliance risk. So we're already starting to see regulators in various markets take enforcement actions against companies that have not accurately disclosed the sustainable or ESG aspects of their strategy. There's been enforcement actions in Australia. There's been actions here in the US. There's been actions in other jurisdictions. And I think I spoke to somebody that was formerly at the US regulator, the SEC, and we were talking about some of the cases that the US SEC has brought, and they were really the obvious cases. Ones where managers didn't have policies and procedures in place as to how they were incorporating ESG considerations, or they weren't following those strategies. Now that's very basic, and managers should be doing that regardless of whether they're considering ESG factors or other types of factors. But that just shows you that they're really just scratching the surface and bringing the obvious cases. There's probably many more cases to come. Furthermore, as new laws and regulations are passed, regulators will be enforcing those new rules as well. And the final point, final benefit for managers is that adopting best practice standards can enhance your brand. It shows that, again, you're trying to go above and beyond, and it shows that you are doing more than just what the regulator requires you to do. It shows you're putting clients' interests first. Next, I'd like to tell you about why these standards are global or universal in nature. We actually, when we first started this exercise, started developing these standards 4 years ago, the first thing we did was research to make sure that we weren't reinventing the wheel. And we looked at over 125 different frameworks and regulations and other standards and codes. And what we found was there were maybe 3 that were designed to deliver fund or strategy level ESG disclosures. But they were designed for particular sorts of products. Like they were designed for funds, public equity funds or public bond funds, but not for private markets. They were designed for impact strategies, but not other types of strategies. They were designed for certain regions, not others. So even if you put them all together, it wasn't a complete set of standards. And so what we did was we looked at the good things in those standards, and where their disclosure requirements made sense, we elevated them and incorporated them. And then we filled in the gaps too. And what we ended up with is standards that incorporate or can be used regardless of the ESG approaches used in funds and strategies. And funds don't just use one of these, they often use more than one. So we recognize that there's a mix and match approach. The standards can be used regardless of the sort of vehicle that the strategy is offered through. So it could be, you can use this with pooled funds, with ETFs, strategies by which separate accounts are managed, partnerships, even certain kinds of contracts. They can be used for all asset classes. Public, private, equity, fixed income alternatives can be used for multi-asset products. Can even be used for funds of funds type products. And last, they can be used in all jurisdictions. We've carefully looked at all the rules and regulations that have been passed or proposed. And we know that these rules are consistent and complementary. Furthermore, the standards, we don't have any policy objectives here. We're not trying to get investors to invest in a certain way or to have certain motives or to pursue certain goals. The only goal with these standards is to help managers clearly articulate the strategy. And I'll say that they can also be used, people often ask this question, well, does a product have to be named or labeled as an ESG or sustainable strategy? And the answer to that is no. These standards certainly are very much applicable, and I'd say almost universally applicable in that case. But you do see products called, for example, the Global Equity Fund that uses ESG information to make better investment decisions. And so these standards can apply in that case as well. Managers don't have to apply these standards to every single fund or strategy that they offer. We'd love it if they did. We'd recommend that. But we understand that it would take time for managers to do that. And we don't want them to have to wait until they've written an ESG disclosure statement for every single fund or strategy before they can claim compliance. So we designed the claim of compliance to be at the product level. And the disclosure statement simply says, we, the firm, have prepared these disclosures for this particular product in accordance with the standards. And so this gives managers a lot of flexibility and control over resources in terms of how they're applying these standards. But hopefully what we hopefully want to see happen is that managers start with a particular product or set of products and then work to apply the standards across their offerings. Next, I want to talk about the mechanism where managers make these disclosures. I guess we came up with a term, is what I'm trying to say, called an ESG disclosure statement. So firms would make these disclosures in a document we call an ESG disclosure statement. And you can simply think about that as a document that contains all the required disclosures that are applicable to a specific investment product or products. You could certainly write an ESG disclosure statement that covers more than one fund or strategy if it uses the same underlying methodologies and all the information is the same. And the standards require that managers make their ESG disclosure statements available to investors, but they don't specify the exact methodology for doing that. So for example, managers that offer a fund to retail investors and offer that through their website, they could put this ESG disclosure statement on the website along with the prospectus and other marketing material. If it's an institutional strategy, managers could put this ESG disclosure statement maybe as an appendix in the pitch book. And there's certainly other ways to do it too. You could hand this ESG disclosure statement to a client if you were having a face-to-face meeting. Now, these disclosure statements are designed to be read by investors. And we've developed, as part of the standards, 4 sample disclosure statements. And we found that they're generally 3 to 5 pages in length. That's what we're finding for managers who are putting this into practice as well. And there's benefits to that. again, clients don't have to go searching through the prospectus and other marketing material to get an idea. They can look at this one single document. It's 3 to 5 pages. There's a summary, and then there's detailed information. And so it's very digestible. It's a great way for prospective investors, again, to understand the ESG and sustainability related aspects of the product. Now, a bit more about regulations. So again, I said we started working on these standards 4 years ago. And at that time, there really was only one jurisdiction that had any specific ESG disclosures, ESG disclosure requirements for funds and strategies, and that was Hong Kong. They had their green circular out at that time, around 2019, I believe, is when the first version came out. And then as we started the process, we saw SFDR level 1 came out, but level 1, if you're familiar with that regulation, is quite high level and vague. We didn't know what the details would look like. And so we kept working on the standards. And now over the last 4 years, we've seen about a dozen different jurisdictions either pass or propose ESG specific requirements for funds and strategies. And when you look across the rules in different jurisdictions, you'll see that the requirements can be quite different. The EU has taken an approach whereby the main question that they want the disclosures to answer is the product sustainable? They care mostly about how the fund or strategy might impact environmental or social issues. They care about how the fund is contributing to their goals to create a circular economy in Europe. There are very little specific requirements about the particular methodologies that the manager uses. In fact, the SFDR template simply says, what strategy does this product pursue? And that could leave managers with some questions about, well, what sort of information should they disclose and what sort of level of detail? In that case, this is exactly where the standards might be helpful, is that in describing the 7 different methodologies, and we think that that's a complete list. We haven't run into a product yet that can't be explained through these 7 methodologies. That's a great framework for managers to use even when they're thinking about or preparing their regulatory disclosures. In the US, our regulator has gone the exact opposite way, which is to propose disclosures that really don't say anything about the ultimate sustainability of a fund or strategy, but are very specific about the methodologies that the manager is using. Their main concern is that investors understand what they're buying and they have information to evaluate a fund or strategy. So if there's one thing that is, and I've read all these rules, and in many cases have written comment letters when there's the opportunity. If there's one thing I can say that is a standard expectation around the world, it's the expectation that managers disclose the way the product is put together. And that is what the global ESG disclosure standards for investment products are designed to do. And even if you don't even if you don't comply fully with the standards and create an ESG disclosure statement, one thing I would recommend that you do is at least read them and become familiar with them so that you can maybe understand that there is some guidance and resources available should there questions come up for you about what sorts of things should be disclosed and how they should be disclosed and what practices might be more misleading or more of a misrepresentation and what good practice looks like. So almost to the last slide here. If you are interested in moving forward and learning more about how to comply with the standards or perhaps adopting the standards, and you're an investment manager, there's essentially 4 steps. The first is to prepare 1 or more ESG disclosure statements. We are working with over a dozen firms now that are working through this process, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that looks like. So what we're saying is, that managers, the first thing they want to do is to better understand the requirements. So they'll pick one fund or strategy. Sometimes it's their flagship product that is distributed the most. Sometimes it's They pick an easier fund. Sometimes they pick a really hard fund with the thought that, well, if we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. So sometimes they do it for a product that's just rolling out. So there isn't necessarily a standard way to pick one fund or strategy. That's sort of depends on business needs. But that's the first thing, is to prepare an ESG disclosure statement. And we as CFA Institute staff have been offering to help managers with this by reviewing their drafts and helping them make sure that they've assessed their requirements correctly, and helping them make sure that the disclosures that they've written are clear and consistent. So that usually takes probably 2 or 3 rounds of drafting to get to a place where the firm feels that it's finalized and they're happy with it. The second thing then is to document policies and procedures for establishing and maintaining compliance with the standards. This is one of the requirements that's in the standards. And the standards don't have specific requirements about what the policies and procedures need to look like. But the sorts of things you'd want to cover are who decides in the firm which products or funds or strategies that will have an ESG disclosure statement, and who will sign off on it, who's accountable for making sure that all the information is right, and who will maintain that. We do have a guide that we're working on, and we're about to publish it. It'll be out in a few weeks probably, to give firms some guidance about how to go about preparing policies and procedures. Third, you need to notify CFA Institute that you have used the standards. And we just do this for a couple of reasons. One is we want to have a point of contact at firms that are using the standards so we can communicate with them. For example, if we make updates to the standards. And we want to understand how many people are putting these into practice so that we have a better understanding of the amount of resources to commit to these standards and other things like this. You do not need to submit your ESG disclosure statement to us. You simply have to give us points of contact and just give us the number that you've prepared and the number that you've had independently verified, if any. That's not a requirement either, it's just a recommendation. And last but not least, then you would need to make the ESG disclosure statements available to investors. Again, you could do that by posting it to a website, or you could have a process or procedures in place such that it's part of a checklist, for example, of the information that you hand to clients, say in a client meeting. So it's really those 4 steps. It's rather straightforward. And again, we have a number of managers that are working through this process. We have one that's all the way through. Macquarie has prepared 2 ESG disclosure statements for 2 different funds and strategies. And again, there's going to be we have other managers that are getting very close to completing the process as well. If you are an asset owner or a consultant or a distributor or an advisor, then what we would recommend that you do is start requesting this information. You could simply just ask a manager as part of your due diligence process, do you have an ESG disclosure statement that complies with the global ESG disclosure standards for investment products? If so, I would really like to review it. That would make my job easier. And what we found through our past experience with, for example, the GIPS standards, is when asset owners and consultants just ask the question, it signals to managers that they are interested in getting better, higher quality information. And then they go look to the standards and they start adopting the standards. So industry standards are often sort of a chicken and an egg sort of problem where sometimes people don't want to ask for it if they don't think it's available, and people don't want to prepare any information if people aren't asking for it. So we need to have support and adoption from both sides. And we are also working with asset owners and consultants, promoting these standards to encourage them to simply ask the question. Last but not least, I want to let you know that we have a number of resources available for managers that want to explore or adopt the standards. We have the standards themselves, and they're available in 4 different languages now. We have a technical handbook that explains the requirements and gives additional guidance, and it gives additional samples of how you can meet the disclosure requirements. Again, that's a benefit of standards. It's not something you get from regulators typically. They just put out the rules and you have to make your own interpretations. We try and support people with additional resources. There is a template that managers can use. This is an optional standardized template. It helps managers think through the different requirements. What we're finding is that managers find this very helpful when they first start to prepare the ESG disclosure statement. But then what they're finding is that, well, there's blanks in the template. And that's one of the cons of using templates in general, is that some things aren't applicable and then there's a whole bunch of white space or blank information. So you don't have to use the template. You can simply then take the disclosures that are relevant, put them in a clean document, so to speak, and that can be your ESG disclosure statement. We also have assurance procedures. So just to talk a little bit about assurance, if you're familiar with the GIPS standards, you might be familiar with a process called verification. Verification is when an independent third party examines the GIPS reports and the underlying processes and provides an opinion about whether the firm is meeting the GIPS standards. We have a similar process here that we call examination, by which an independent third party would look at a fund's ESG disclosure statement and do some testing to make sure that it is an accurate representation of how the fund is being designed and to some extent implemented. That too can be very helpful to managers because it's a standardized way to get an independent party to give you an opinion about how good your disclosures are. And again, if you chose to do that, you might get some valuable information about where you could improve. And that, again, might help you from a regulatory standpoint to make sure that you're doing it, you're making all your disclosures clearly and correctly and accurately. We have a help desk, and those emails usually come to me. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out through that help desk. I'm happy to answer your questions. And then we also are working on some cross-references between the standards and the regulations in some jurisdictions. We already have this cross-reference for the EU SFDR. We've just finished it for the Hong Kong circular. We're working on it for the Canadian regulations. So, as we're able and as we have resources, we're doing that cross-reference to help people understand how much overlap there is between the standards and their local regulatory requirements, and helping show where the regulations might be a little bit vague, pointing you to specific provisions in the standards that might be helpful to you. So with that, that is the end of my presentation today. I hope you found it interesting and helpful, and maybe see how the ESG standards might be useful to you at some point in some way. And I'd be happy to take any questions that you have.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So far, there are no questions. So probably your presentation is very clear, or so if there's anyone that wants to ask a question, please type the questions in the chat box or raise hand. The questions can be asked in English or Indonesian. I will translate if you want to ask in Indonesian.
I can ask a question to kickstart the questioning, the Q&A. If I were an asset manager and I have already identified, say, an investment product that is popular, to my clients, in order to make it more competitive, I feel that it would be a good idea to comply with the ESG disclosure standards. What would you recommend as the first step in achieving that?
Yeah, so the first step would be to download the standards and read through them and familiarize yourself with exactly the sort of information that they're requiring. The second step would be to determine the applicability of different requirements. So not every provision is going to apply to every particular product. So the next step would be essentially to go through those methodologies that I talked about earlier. Say, yes, we are using ESG integration in this product. Yes, we have some screens that use ESG criteria. And yes, we incorporate it in stewardship. We don't have any allocation rules that involve ESG or sustainability. We don't have any particular portfolio level characteristics. We don't have a particular impact objective. Those don't apply. Then the next step would be to then write disclosures or gather information that would satisfy the requirements. And what we found is that firms actually have a lot of this information already. The problem is it's not necessarily all in one place. So you might have to go to the fund's prospectus. You might have to go to the investment policy. You might have to go to the RFP team and ask, well, what are they saying when they're responding to DDQs? And then gathering essentially that information, make sure it's complete, it's accurate, and then just writing in a way that is clear and concise and can be understood by a prospective client.
Thank
Thank you.
There's a question from the chat room from Pak Dana. During this Ukraine war, is that right that the ESG standards are sort of being relaxed by the SEC and exchanges?
That the standards are being relaxed?
Yeah.
I don't see any evidence of that. If I look globally, standards and regulations are still in a process of evolving. So, for example, SFDR was released, I think, a year or year and a half ago, and they're continuing to give guidance, and they've even are looking at maybe an SFDR 1.5. They know that the regulators know that these regulations are complex, and they know that they probably aren't going to get them totally right the first time. And then they are continually then updating them. Unfortunately, that causes a lot of confusion and churn in the marketplace. So managers that are operating in Europe are, from what I hear, rather frustrated that they have to continually keep writing their disclosures, or they have to keep doing work to satisfy a moving target. Maybe in some respects they're being relaxed. In some ways, there's some debate about, for example, what they call Article 9 funds, which are funds that have a sustainable investment objective. Now, initially, the regulators never defined what that meant, and there's been some back and forth about, well, what percentage of assets in a Article 9 fund need to align with that taxonomy. This might be a question that's relevant to Indonesia as you develop your own taxonomy and your own products. And so you could very much learn from what's happening in other marketplaces. The regulators have at one point said it should be 100%, right? But that's a little bit, it might be impractical. A fund might need to hold cash. It might need to have other sorts of investments for liquidity or for risk management purposes. So, it just gets into the details around these things, and you can easily get lost in all the details. This is what makes this a confusing area of the industry, but also one that requires the involvement of investment professionals. We need people like you to be engaged and to ask questions and to offer feedback and come up with ideas, to come up with a system that's workable and practical and that protects investors.
Okay, thank you. There's a second question from Hega Wahyudi. So the background is Indonesia's regulator will enforce the sustainable finance reporting starting 2000. The application is 2024, and the first reporting is due in 2025 for asset managers. So the question is, hi Chris, what do you think that will be the most problematic issue for Indonesian regulator to enforce the ESG investment implementation for the asset management in Indonesia?
That's a great question, and I'll admit that I don't know all of the details about that Indonesian regulation. From my own experience looking at funds and strategies, it can be quite subjective or judgmental. When you look at a certain set of information and you're trying to determine if it might be misrepresentation or it might be misleading, or even if it's accurate or not, it requires a lot of work to read all that material, to do all the investigation and testing that you need to do to ultimately come up with an opinion or an assessment about whether a report or set of disclosures meets a particular set of requirements. So I would just say that there's going to be a lot of questions that come up if the disclosures are written in a vague sort of way. It's going to require a lot of subjectivity or a judgment on their part that could lead to uncertainties for managers about, well, really, what sort of information should we be providing? So it will likely be an iterative process. They'll probably need to learn as they go. That's what we're seeing from other regulators, where they're not necessarily bringing enforcement actions or writing up deficiency letters the first round. They're more like collecting information. They're asking a lot of questions so that they can help develop their own expertise and judgments. But then they are in later rounds then using that judgment.
Thank you. The next one is from Siti Rahmawati. How is the industry acceptance and implementation of this global standards so far? Which countries have more players to implement the standards?
Yeah, so first let me say that industry standards don't get adopted overnight. Any industry standard usually takes several years for people to become aware of them and then start putting them into practice and ultimately becoming the de facto. The GIPS standards maybe are there, but it's taken 20 years. So we are seeing good traction in Canada is one place. There's a couple reasons for that. One is their regulator has put out guidance that's fairly clear. It aligns really well with the requirements and the standards. And we've had some people in the CFA societies there that have been very active and very helpful in promoting the standards, in particular, setting up one-on-one meetings. Because to be honest with you, like presentations like this, they help build awareness. But firms don't then immediately go out and say, hey, I want to start using the standards. It usually requires a one-on-one meeting to share this information again, to give them the opportunity to ask their own personal questions in a more private setting. And then to share that information amongst colleagues and peers. And then they have to figure out, well, which resources are available to work on this, and where does this fall in terms of our priorities? To be honest, we haven't got much traction in Europe because everyone there tells me that all of the resources that they have that would generally be involved in this sort of project are currently trying to fulfill SFDR regulations, which I said keep changing. And so I just don't know when their resources would become available to start looking at voluntary global standards, when the most pressing thing at the moment is satisfying new regulatory standards. We're also just seeing some good traction in some other places. US, we're getting some good traction, even though we don't have regulatory certainty yet. There's still some interest from more proactively minded managers that see the value and want to get a jump on what may be coming from the SEC.
Yes, I want to follow up because you touched on the SFDR. So if a fund already fulfilled the SFDR, do you still need like assurance that it follows the global standards? If it says that we follow the global standards of CFA.
Yeah, the two are not so interchangeable that you could say, I've done my SFDR disclosures, now I can claim compliance with the global ESG disclosure standards, nor vice versa. So again, there's some differences, but again, we've tried to design it in a way such that they are complementary. And again, remember, we started these before we even knew that regulators might go down this path, or without the knowledge of what some regulations would even look like if they'd come out, or the timing of when they'd come out. And so part of the exercise was, in fact, to try and influence regulators and influence their thinking about what sorts of requirements they should put in to their regulations. And we're actually pretty happy that regulators, again, have come out with rules that align very well. Now, regulators often won't say how they've been influenced, but we do see in some cases, regulators have used some of the very close or exact language from the standards. So we know that they are having some effect and they are influential with regulators.
Okay, thank you. Now the next one is from Yadi Mona Lisa. Until now, ESG sustainability reports in many countries are still voluntary. And also there is no audit in the sustainability report. And it can encourage companies to do greenwashing in making ESG sustainability reports.
Mm-hmm.
With ESG disclosure standards, is this sufficient for investment managers to detect greenwashing practices in ESG sustainability report? Also, in your opinion, apart from ESG disclosure standard, what is needed to prevent companies from doing the greenwashing?
These are great questions. There are so many ways that a firm or a product might mislead an investor. And it's very hard to come up with the full universe of all the different ways. It's very hard to come up with bright line rules to say, this is correct, this is not. Maybe there's some places, for example, CFA Institute, we've pointed out a couple of times that we don't think a fund should say that it's fossil fuel free unless it's actually totally free of fossil fuels. If you think about the words fat-free on foods, is it really fat-free? Well, at least here in the US, the regulations allow there to be some fat. So it's not actually fat-free, it's just mostly fat-free. But that's the sort of thing that can cause confusion for investors and make them feel like they're being misled. So we just don't think that's a good practice to use that word unless it really is completely free. Let's not do things that might be misleading. The global ESG disclosure standards, they only cover certain aspects, right? We're only talking about funds and strategies here. We're not talking about statements that firms make, for example, if they adhere to the PRI principles or if they've signed on to net zero. We don't cover that. And to your point about sustainability reports, these are voluntary, I think as you correctly said, in most places, but the SEC recently brought an enforcement action against a company for information that it presented in its sustainability report. So even though it wasn't necessarily part of the regulatory filings, they still brought a case. And so I don't think you can say, well, that's just advertising and we're safe. And I see more and more the trend towards regulators probably pulling more of this information in to regulatory filings. And even CFA Institute has kind of put out opinions and comment letters that say, we actually think more of this information is financially material and relevant. It should be subject to the same sort of disclosure rules and safeguards that other information is disclosed under. So more and more of this, I wouldn't be surprised, let's just say, if more and more of this information starts falling under the regulatory regime and becomes mandatory.
Okay. Thank you. The next one is from Ibnu Anjar Widodo. What would be the main benefit from the perspective of risk and returns of an ESG fund products compared to plain vanilla investment products to investors?
Just to confirm, you said the risk and return benefits of ESG?
Yeah, from the perspective of risk and return.
Yes, so that is not a question that can be answered universally. It really depends on how ESG factors are being used in the funder strategy. If we're talking about material ESG factors, which means the manager has gone through the exercise of looking at a wide array of different ESG factors and has pinpointed ones that they believe might affect risk and return, well, then you would, under the kind of theory of active management, you would say, well, the more information, the better. Right? At least I'm looking at that information and using it as part of my evaluation. It may not produce massive alpha. I don't know or not, but we could certainly point to some specific cases where if the proper assessment was done, a big loss could have been avoided, perhaps. So, there's certainly some risk management benefit there. You could also look at, on the opportunity side, you could look at how the company, the sorts of products and services it develops. And is there changing market demand? Do more people want those sort of products because of sustainability issues? Do you think that would increase their revenue? So again, it's impossible to answer that question, because for many funds and strategies, this information is being used as part of the investment analysis process, and you can't then pinpoint that information and say, here's exactly how it impacts risks and returns. Another way that you might use ESG information is restricting the investment universe. If you do that for values or for reasons other than risk and return, you're shrinking the universe. And the law of active management says anytime that you shrink your universe, you might not be getting optimal risk and returns, or you are constraining your optimal risk and return. So you have to look at that aspect as well. And anytime that you have dual objectives, like if you're pursuing risk and return, but you're also trying to pursue some real world impact, there might be a balancing of those objectives. Managers often aren't explicit about that. You could maybe come up with some sort of explicit function like, well, it's 60% risk and return and 40% impact objective, and thus I can maximize that. But in practice, that's usually you usually can't get that quantitative about it. But a secondary objective might sort of act as a weight or a balance or somewhat of a constraint too. So people often debate this point. It's one of the main points of debate. But again, it's really, you have to look at certain facts and circumstances to even start to make that determination. So just not a universal answer there.
Okay, thank you. The next one is from Duma Siagian. If ESG standards in Indonesia is still a bit judgmental, how can we keep or defend the assessments that we make?
Well, lots of things are judgmental, aren't they? In investment management, and in part, like, isn't that why people hire investment professionals? It's for their technical knowledge and their professional judgment. So I think that we need to allow for it, and in fact, it's something that I think we should talk about, and it's important to talk about. Is there's going to be certain things that as an investment professional, I'm making a judgment on. It's not investing. Some investment products might be 100% rules driven. An index might be 100% rules driven, and if you're following that index exactly, that could be all rules driven, and that's fine. Maybe some people want that, but in many cases, it's judgment. So I think record keeping is important to maybe justify your decisions, to at least record, well, these are the things I sort of looked at, these were things that we thought about, and this is the decision that we made. And again, I think there should be some allowances that different people will make different judgments.
Okay, I think that's the last question that we have, and we're 8 p.m. on the dot. So
okay, super. Well, thank you for these questions. These were terrific questions. So I appreciate I appreciate the participation and appreciate the opportunity to speak about the standards and talk to you today about ESG investing and sustainable finance.
Thank you. And Dewi, the next one, yeah. The next, so CFA Society Indonesia has conducted several ESG related theme webinars. We did ESG introduction last year, and then we also did like a women, like a social part of the ESG with the women empowerment. So the next one, the ESG related event that we have is actually in-person event. It's on June 15. So we're going to talk about the asset manager's role in the net zero carbon transition. Please register on that. The address is there, or you can contact us for the link to register. Also, the CFA Society, CFA Institute have a certificate in ESG investing for those of you who wants to deepen your knowledge on the ESG investing. You can go to the CFA Institute website and register there. We also have classes starting this month, yeah, Pak Rahmat, yeah.
Yeah.
So with that, we thank Chris for the very insightful discussions and also the participants for the great questions. So we hope that we can meet in the next events, both online or virtual events. Pak Rahmat,
Thank you, Chris and Eddie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
The link for the next event is on the chat room for the net zero carbon. If you want to register, you can click on the link. Okay, that's it for me. I'll return to Pak Rahmat if you want.
All right, everyone. Have a good evening. Thanks once again, Chris and Eddie. See you around.
Thank you for having us.
That was nice.
Goodbye, everyone.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Have a good evening. Have a good morning, Chris.
Okay,
Have a good
bye.
day.
Thank you, everybody.